Hello, everyone. I'm Garrett Womble, and thank you for joining. Today's presentation and discussion will be held by PRAXIS3 Principal David Hamilton, who is a resident of the city of Atlanta, has been practicing in Atlanta for over 30 years, and is involved with Central Atlanta Progress. He's on the board of the Freedom Park Conservancy, the Atlanta Architecture and Design Center, and the Beltline Design Review Committee. We appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions you may have following today's discussion. Those questions can be submitted throughout the presentation by using the dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to David Hamilton to get us started.
Thank you, Garrett. Appreciate that. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to our respective basements here in the age of COVID-19. Hopefully that will change one day, but for now we are here making the best we can of not great situation. Today we're going to talk about the George, and the George in the context of what's happening now, or what's happening and will continue to happen, I believe, after this crisis in the city of Atlanta. The George opened now a couple of years ago in 2017, 2018. At the time, it was the newest mixed-use building on the Memorial Drive corridor in the Grant Park neighborhood. Roughly speaking, it's a 6-story mid-rise building, 132 apartment units, about 9,000 square feet of restaurant and retail space. This is a reprise of an earlier presentation, actually a couple of years ago at the High Museum. It was presented for the first time for Architectural Record on the Road. It was presented along with a couple of other projects, a small condominium project in a Atlanta neighborhood and a high-rise in Midtown. And this was kind of the medium-sized project of those three. It was later reprised, the same presentation, for the Architectural Record Continuing Education Center, and was a continuing education presentation. Today will be the third time, and it's been updated a bit for present day situations and contingencies, I guess would be the right word. So the beginning is really not when we started construction, or not even when the land was bought or zoning or anything else. The beginning was in 2001, and actually before that, not quite accurate, 1999. When my firm, I was at that time a single practitioner, and the firm I work for now, or work with now, PRAXIS3, was commissioned to do the Memorial Drive study. That study was a comprehensive study with the predecessor firm of PRAXIS3, Rahman Pearsall and Verge Studios, which was my firm, the 2-mile-long Memorial Drive corridor, all the way from the state capitol to Moreland Avenue, for those of you who know the area. The study was to last, I think, 4 to 6 months. It lasted for a year and a half, continuing on into the new millennium from 1999 to about 2000, or sometime in 2000. It consisted of over 100 meetings with neighbors, business owners, city planners, and other stakeholders. So it was a very thorough study. We listened to the concerns and ideas of a whole lot of people. Since we are more architects than planners, we looked at it in a very architectural way. And we wanted to suggest what the street should feel like, should be like, to be in, to live and work on the street, and what it should look like. The site's that small green square at the corner of Memorial and Hill, just above the D that says Grant Park there. It is really the entrance to North Grant Park, a very, very important gateway to the neighborhood and to the west downtown. So again, in a year and a half, we heard many ideas, but we had to look at the sort of context of what was there already, how the city was developing, how we wanted it to develop. And we had to look at the density along the corridor, which was almost non-existent. The corridor was a problem for the neighborhood. It was mostly abandoned, vacant lots. The neighborhoods around them in 1999, 2000 were thriving, but the corridor itself was not. It was mostly underused industrial properties, vacant lots, things like that. Our kind of primary idea was that density along the corridor, and there was at that time development pressure and also desires by the neighborhood to have more services that they needed, retail and neighborhood services, that could fill the void that was the corridor, and the corridor was actually a connecting tissue between the neighborhoods as well. It also became pretty clear during the meetings that there was a short block between Martin Luther King and Memorial that was not really wide enough for substantial development, but was linear and connected the state capitol to the gateway to Oakland Cemetery. Making this corridor a park, a linear park, was not a particularly new idea. It had been around for a while, but it became concretized and obvious to us that it was something that a lot of people in the neighborhoods really desired. And obviously having this connection and having this green space could really become a focus, at least for the western part of the Memorial Drive corridor, and actually help to spur development as well. It's one of the few places in the city where Civil War and civil rights history come together, which was unique. Martin Luther King Center is very close by. Memorial Drive was originally named for the Memorial Park, which was Stone Mountain Park. So there's that not so fortunate tie into the Civil War as well. We also noticed very quickly in looking at precedents the resemblance to the scale of a place like Commonwealth Avenue. It was pointed out to us, and lots of architects in the neighborhood were familiar with it, and people that had traveled to Boston and the Northeast, particularly in its width and length. It looked very closely, very much like Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, and had a similar kind of function, although Commonwealth Avenue doesn't have those two very strong poles of Oakland Cemetery and the state capitol. So the heart of the plan here was to create a street wall of retail, mixed use, residential, maybe office, although residential it seemed at the time and still is the kind of primary use along the corridor. We looked at how the corridor should look, how it should be a pedestrian corridor. We looked at, active street level uses and a moderately scaled residential or office use above. Those two examples, and the scale very much of Commonwealth Avenue here is appropriate, if not the style particularly, but the scale is pretty perfect. And then we looked at the time at the NODA study in Charlotte, North Carolina, which had a similar scale but used a modern kind of architectural language and vernacular. So the heart of the study is really here. We had a major transportation corridor, which was the MLK Memorial Drive corridor. There were plans for a streetcar, obviously a heavily used road, heavy rail with the MARTA line that parallels all this, and plans for walking and biking, which were again kind of reinforced by the notion that there would be a park kind of in the middle of this, at least on the western half. Again, the higher density commercial shell along the street, we decided on a 6-story approximately model, 66 to 76 feet we thought would be a good scale, but allow for the density that was sort of desired here and demanded here by the folks that would be developing this area and by the neighbors themselves. That's the front of the block. The back of the block kind of transitions down. It has a transitional height plane, which is typical in the city, but it's a medium density zone that would allow for small apartment building or townhouses, which is in fact what's really happened there in the last few years. This plan has kind of begun to come into fruition in a very big way in the last few years, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And then the neighborhood streets, kind of separating the density of the block that parallels Memorial Drive and the single-family neighborhoods, which are mostly almost entirely residential fabric. Many of them are protected historic areas. So that was really the kind of key and the sort of Rosetta Stone to how this area would be developed in the future. And we thought it was actually a very good plan. So a few years later, the city actually came back to us and said, hey, we are very understaffed, which was not unusual at the time in city planning. And we really are in the process of converting your study into zoning. Can you help us write the zoning ordinance, which we did, which was kind of unique for us and for a lot of consultants who would do a planning study. So we did do a draft of the zoning. Unfortunately, the city attorneys did sort of take it over at some point, which they had to, I suppose. And it's a little more complicated, perhaps, than it might be. But the essence of our study is there. The kind of tree-lined streets and the kind of medium density, pedestrian-oriented environment, the kind of new urbanist perspective, and the transition down into the neighborhoods. Here on this slide, you actually see an application for an SAP, which this was an SAP, Special Administrative Permit area. It is rather complicated and rather time consuming. Hopefully, in this case and many other cases in the city, it's definitely worth it to make a better city. I wish that the process could be a little more streamlined, and this is probably, unfortunately, a simplified version of that, and all the kind of steps that you have to go through and all the review committees and all of that before you get down to step number 11, and the Office of Buildings and Planning Department actually approves and issues a permit as part of the permitting process. So to talk a little more specifically about the building, our efforts to design the building, study the building began in about 2015. The building was completed in 2017. Not at all an unusual kind of time frame for something from beginning to end, a development project of this scale. But I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about that, and how we designed the building, and then how the building fits into this new kind of planning context. This is one of actually my favorite quotes. "It is the sport to have the engineer hoisted by his own petard." And of course, it's from Hamlet. And it's really about how we make these incredible plans that we think are going to benefit us, and in this case, everybody. And then when you are kind of subjected to your own plans, in this case, a zoning ordinance, you may find it a little more difficult than you had imagined. So that definitely happened to us. And petard being a 16th century bomb, we were a little bit, blown up by our own bomb in this case. So the site at the corner of Hill Street and Memorial Drive, very important. I can't emphasize how important this is as an entry, both to the downtown area that you see to your left, and to the south here to the Grant Park neighborhood. We'll go into what was there before, which really wasn't much, in a minute, but just to say, we did some preliminary studies for Urban Realty Partners, which they were the developer for this site, and how they got to be that. It's also an interesting story, which I'll touch on just a little bit in a minute as well. But suffice to say, we started using conceptually some Fulton County tax maps, which are usually relatively accurate, some city topos, which are relatively accurate for what we were doing. And that was essentially trying to take the developers, Urban Realty's pro forma, and put it on the site and fit it within all of the kind of zoning parameters, east and west, north and south, and also the height. What we discovered when the project became real was that the Fulton County tax maps were wrong. They're usually wrong by a little bit. In this case, they were off by about 20 feet in both directions, to the north, south, and east, west, which little known to the client would put us into a bit of a panic mode, and said, can we get this pro forma on this site? We were looking at first at a 5-story building, which fit fairly easily, gave us nice floor to floor heights. We had a lot of topo on the site, so we didn't have to battle that. A 5-story building, and that would meet the pro forma. But when we lost that area, we were looking suddenly at a 6-story building. And we were very close to the height limitations, and maybe a little bit over at first. So we immediately had a problem. We did work closely with the city, who wanted this kind of development to happen. They knew we did the zoning ordinance, which helped. They knew we were, our heads and our hearts were in the right place, as well as a developer who got a lot of credit as well. They knew that these guys wanted to do the right thing. And we looked at the zoning in many different ways. There were maybe a few creative zoning interpretations in the end that helped us achieve the kind of height requirement that we needed for a 6-story building in order to make the development work. It meant that our floor to floors were critical, that there wasn't an inch to spare, that we would barely fit into that height requirement. So we had to be very careful about that, and it affected our structural design and everything else. A little note about how the site actually looked before this, and as I said, it was not a pedestrian, not an urban environment at all. It was a lot of vacant lots, a lot of abandoned buildings. You can see it's a pretty hostile environment. You really had no good reason to want to walk down the street, because it was a street really to nowhere. There wasn't much there, and it wasn't very comfortable. You were really walking very close to a very busy street with very little, kind of urban amenity or pedestrian friendly environment there at all. On the site itself, you see there was the, go to the next slide, the Azar Liquor Store, which was a neighborhood landmark, not a good neighborhood landmark. It was the kind of place where a sales clerk would come to a bulletproof glass window and ask you what you wanted and sort of slip it under the window to you. It was a fairly dangerous place, not a place that the neighborhood relished or wanted to really survive in the long future, but it was a neighborhood landmark of sorts. There was sold to one developer, the 2008 recession kind of scuttled that deal. The family, which owned the Azar family, which owned the property, was looking for someone else to buy it. Urban Realty made a great offer that they could not refuse. They all wanted to sell it except for the fellow who owned the liquor store. And he did not think it was a good idea, did not really get along very well with his brothers and relatives. I won't go into it because we could take the rest of the presentation, but the day the property was closed on, the cast of characters that actually went and closed the liquor store included an attorney, a priest, and a City of Atlanta police officer. And there were suffice to say, there was a lot of, and a shotgun actually, which I won't really mention too much more, but a lot of effort went into securing this site and a lot of interest there. The sales agreement, interestingly, required that the development honor the family patriarch, who was George Azar. And he was a former Georgia Tech basketball player before he was an assembler of land all over Atlanta and a seller of alcoholic spirits. So the building, finally get to the design here, and you see Hill Street Memorial, that very, very important corner. You see that the building wraps the corner. It puts retail on the ground level at the corner and then down the street. The lobby, gym, and a couple of ground floor units, which were a later addition, actually activate the street in a significant kind of way. The parking is behind. The building wraps the parking in a fairly typical manner, but there are a lot of very wide pedestrian passages that help to bring people from the parking into the front of the building and help to create a very very good pedestrian environment and a very urbane and urban environment, which was the whole point of the building. Upstairs are the apartments, and about 75% of the units, studio 1 and 2 bedroom units, face the skyline and the streetscape, which was very intentional and was kind of the nature of the site, but also something we really wanted to do. There are a few that face an interior courtyard and another view towards the south, but most of them face out. There's a pool on the parking deck, which is up high, has very nice views, and I'll go into more detail about that in a minute. So one thing I'll say about this kind of building, it is a bit of a puzzle to make these units sort of fit together in a way that makes a coherent and aesthetically pleasing facade. And here you see the final building, and you see that corner, which was very important in the retail below and the units above, but kind of unifying that streetscape with the rest of the building and kind of making a composition, hopefully a pleasing composition, out of those units is a challenge, and it's always a challenge in this kind of building. I think we've been pretty successful with it here, and I'll go into a few more details about how we did that in a minute. The corner, you see those kind of odd angles. That just was not an architectural conceit. It was actually the kind of weird property lines that took place at the corner, so that the edge of the building there reflects the property lines of the site, and that gives us kind of interest at the corner. The balconies that come out are very expressive. You see the retail below, which opens directly onto the corner, and then the kind of street level streetscape there, which I'll talk about some more in a minute as well. So a few facts about the building. Location, of course, in the city of Atlanta, North Grant Park neighborhood, about 2 miles from the state capitol. The original program was 130 studio 1 and 2 bedroom units. We ended up with 132. There were a couple at the street. About 8,000 square feet, I think we ended up with street level retail, a rooftop pool and amenity area, gym, lobby with a coffee shop, and I'll talk about that. and the parking for the retail and for the units. The design and construction started in 2015, finished in really 2017, maybe early 2018. It was approximately $16.5 million. The current status, residential is pretty much completely occupied, as is the retail. It's been very, very successful. There's a coffee shop in the lobby, which was an innovation that has been successful as well. The building was sold to investors fairly recently, I believe last year, for a reported 20+ million. It was sold a little sooner than it might have been, which I think was a good sign, and also for what looks to be a pretty good profit. I'm not really privy to all the details there. Perhaps if some of the Urban Realty guys are on the webinar, they want to speak to that. Probably not. But in any case, it was the developer's goal to build a building that was successful and successful enough to be sold at a pretty good profit. Again, street level here, we think is very successful. We spent a lot of time, design effort, kind of designing these two-story kind of units that are almost a townhouse scale on one end of the street, where the clearance is a little bit more, giving them a real pedestrian and urban scale, making it a very nice place to walk. Compare that to the earlier shot of the street as it was before. Wide sidewalks, the required kind of Grant Park streetscape elements, and we think it's actually a pretty nice place to be and a pretty nice place to walk. Looking up at the building above the base, and this is the corner back when actually we were in the design and in the construction phase. But you see how, unlike a lot of buildings you see around town, we tried to obviously define the base in a very specific way, but we also really wanted it to be part of a whole kind of composition. And you see that a lot of the lines in the base and the storefront continue up through the building to kind of tie that whole facade together. Again, the kind of rhythm of the balconies and the expression of the units inside is always a difficult thing, and I think we've been fairly successful here. Again, a few more shots of that. This is on the courtyard side, on the south and east faces of the building. Some interior space. This is the lobby. This is where the leasing office is. Some of the functions of the building, the mail center, the elevator, etc. One of the clients, Urban Realty guys, Simon Toohey, recruited a coffee shop for the lobby, which has been very successful. At the time, was a little bit of a unique thing, and I think it was a great idea. So there's that kind of semi-public amenity for the tenants and for people just walking by. The theme of the George, since it had to be named the George after George Azar, was something that was picked up on by interior designers with PRAXIS3 and by Urban Realty, and each floor is a different George, and you see some of them on the wall here in a painting that was commissioned by the owner. I'd like to recognize PRAXIS3, Hallie Hannaford, and her crew, our interior designers here, who did the lobby, the public spaces and signage, and also, as you'll see in a minute, the model units. I think they did a wonderful job with that. Going up on the opposite side of the building, south side of the building, the pool deck. We did have a pool consultant here. We also worked with a local artist, Will Lawless, and he did some of the elements here, particularly that screen wall that you see around it. I think the pool turned out exceptionally well. Here again, the view is not the city view, but it is a view to the south, which is a more pastoral view. It's actually a view of the Grant Park neighborhood, but the kind of Atlanta city in the forest is very prevalent here, and you see that view is very different than the urban view on the other side, but I think it's very pleasing. And because of the kind of nature of the zoning, it will never be blocked, and we of course get the south sun here as well. So taking a look inside the units, one thing that's important to note here that was unique, more unique at the time, I think, the units are very small. On average, including the studio 1 and 2 bedroom units, they're only about 660 square feet, which is not very big, and by Atlanta standards at the time, it was really not very big. The units are very efficient. There was a process of deduction, process of cutting out everything that wasn't needed and keeping the basics. And I think the units work exceptionally well. Again, 75% of the units have a view of the downtown skyline or the street view, which was important. This is really one of the first buildings in Atlanta. And since then, a lot of buildings have taken this kind of idea, but you really live in the city. You're really living for the city, and not as much for your unit, although the units are very nice, but they're small and they put you in the right location. So a couple of more shots. You see the galley kitchens, which open up here, very efficient, very flexible use of space. You see this wonderful shelf and desk that Hallie and her crew found for the space, which really utilizes the space extremely well. Bedroom, see the city views beyond. Again, very flexible. That you see a small image here of the corridors, and because we were up against a parking deck for much of the corridors, which ended up being very long, we did do some patterning in the floor and some other things with the lighting that hopefully made that a much more pleasant and positive experience. So in 2018, after the building was open, we were very happy to have won an AIA Georgia Award for the design. So that was fantastic and a really good reward and recognition of the struggle and the design quality of this building. So we're very, very proud of that. All right, we're going to change direction just a little bit here and talk a little bit less about the specific building of the George and talk a little bit more about Atlanta and really how the George fits into the pattern of the new Atlanta and what Atlanta is becoming. We're going to talk about what the future may look like post-COVID, and we're going to kind of talk about what we want the city to be, since we all live here and love the place. Again, this is obviously one of the newer slides because this wouldn't have made any sense in 2017 or 18. This shot of Atlanta at rush hour, which almost looks photoshopped, but is not, during the height of the COVID shutdown, is pretty incredible. You see Atlanta's usually busy, overburdened expressways with basically no one on them. The kind of dark cloud hanging over the city. This is a very, very great photograph for that period. And then the kind of reimagined local iconic piece of art, which was a praying hands that said "Pray for Atlanta" by an artist named R. Land, being turned into "Wash for Atlanta" during the COVID crisis. Again, another example. In 2008, PRAXIS3 and BNIM and a company called EDOL, which now has another name, the Landscape Architecture Company, entered the History Channel City of the Future Design Competition, which was a very big national competition, local first and then national. I'm happy to say we won both the Atlanta and the national competition, and we're the champions that year. The program was simple for the competition. Imagine what your city can be and should be in 100 years in the future, which in this case was 2108. The idea very simply here, and I could spend the whole presentation talking about this, but the idea very simply was to bring back a lot of the natural environment of Atlanta, all of the stream beds, which are buried now, were buried by hundreds of years of development, and make a natural place that is a city that is in harmony with its nature, which is especially appropriate for Atlanta, or should be. To make up for the density that was either removed and the new density that would come as the city grew significantly, we posited that there would be large structures that would really be on top of transportation infrastructure, which in this case indicates it's on top of the expressway system, but really the expressways probably wouldn't be there anymore. There'd be some kind of, probably some sort of mass transit we can't even imagine today. And you see the old, ancient by now, old historic buildings as well on the skyline. An example of the not so distant future that we're involved with for Ray Ventures is the Beltline Affordable Housing at 890 Memorial, now known as Madison Reynoldstown, 116 units that are 100% affordable. And We are in the middle of design on this project, and we are very, very excited to get this project up and going and have folks living here. As you know, if you've been down Memorial Drive, this will be literally surrounded by acres of new retail, restaurant, some office, and a lot of residential development, which has some affordable components, but is mostly market rate and pretty expensive. So we're very excited about this building that is 100% affordable. So a little bit about Atlanta in general, kind of pushing back a little further, look at the big view. As everyone knows, Atlanta has been a boom town for a very, very long time. But when you really look at it, the predictions, the growth so far and the predictions of the future are pretty astounding. This is a prediction from the Atlanta Regional Commission of the larger, actually, Atlanta MSA from 2015 to 2050. And by the time we get to 2050, as you can see, we're a city of almost 9 million folks, and this is the metropolitan area, which is pretty astounding considering when I moved here myself in 1982, we were a city of just over 2 million. So a little bit more about that, and I'll just read this. By the time Atlanta's oldest millennials, my children, are in their 60s, the metro population will have surged upwards of 9 million people, leapfrogging larger metros of today, such as Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., according to recent projections by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And this is from a couple of years ago. And you see there prominently featured the Piedmont Atlantic kind of metro, mega region. And really from Birmingham to Raleigh through Charlotte, Greenville, South Carolina, a continuous kind of urban city similar to the Northeastern Corridor, which will grow eventually a few years from now to rival that corridor, if not ever overtake it in population, certainly be a major, major kind of urban corridor in the United States. To look at that trend of population growth a little bit more, this is pretty astounding, and it's something that is not still happening everywhere, but it's still happening in Metro Atlanta, and will, I think, happen even after the present crisis. And that's all up in the air at the moment, but I think it's pretty important to note. If you look on the left side here, these are all of the kind of downtowns of major metropolitan cities all over the country. You see 37 of those downtowns have actually percentage-wise outpaced the growth of their metro area, which in Atlanta's case is pretty significant since the metro area is growing pretty quickly. You see Atlanta is one of those. Atlanta is one of the healthiest downtown or in-town places in the country. You see on the other side of the screen here, sort of the 1880 to 1990, you see the county population versus the downtown, and this is strictly downtown and not the whole city. Versus the metro in terms of percentage, and you see in the 80s the city is still losing population. The 90s that starts to change, but the metro is still growing faster. 2000 to 2010, similar, and then recently, this last decade, you see the city as a percentage is growing much faster than either the county it's in or the entire metro area, which is a total sea change for metropolitan Atlanta, which used to be. Whose growth used to be really dominated by the suburbs. Now it's more or less dominated by downtown areas, although the suburbs and the metro area in general is still growing pretty quickly as well. To pivot just a little more, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Atlanta city design effort, which is a couple of years old now, which was done at the behest of Commissioner City Planning Tim Keane. With a lot of help from Ryan Gravel, who, of course, everybody knows who Ryan is, the visionary behind the Beltline. It's a very inspiring and a far-reaching design document that, in a very broad way, looks at the future of Atlanta and looks at what we can be, what we need to be and want to be, rather than exactly what we are, although it uses what we are as a basis for all of that. In my opinion, they really get Atlanta like no other kind of study as before. There's no cliches, there's no cynical hackneyed observations about Atlanta. It really takes the form of the city now. It really takes the real history and sort of spirit of the city and posits what those things could make happen in our future. It first and foremost uses Dr. King's beloved community as a basis for an aspirational Atlanta, place where everyone can reach their potential regardless of differences. We have a very long way to go to get there. We are one of the most unequal cities in terms of income equality in the country. These are things that need to be addressed, in a very serious way. But using as a basis for your design this kind of aspirational idea is really a wonderful thing, and not something to be taken lightly. So the study really looks at Atlanta for what it is now, or the structure of the city, which is basically a city that's built on corridors. It's a linear city in any number of ways. If you're talking about the Peachtree Ridge or some of the east-west corridors, you can see those here. And one of those is the Memorial Drive corridor. That's really where we tie into the Memorial Drive study. Maybe it's why I like this particular idea and this document so much, is because it really talks about those corridors and how they develop and how they protect the neighborhoods around them by giving a place for that kind of centralized development along these corridors. This form is already here. It's already evident. It's already what the city is. But how can we use that to make a better city? So here are the major corridors in Atlanta that would be where the growth is and where the growth actually already is. And then the conservation areas that preserve the proverbial city in the forest, that emphasize the already built up urban areas, downtown, midtown, east side, west side. And together those things can make an Atlanta that is based on what Atlanta is now, but is a very different city in the future. I actually love this illustration from the city design book. And this is Peachtree Street. This was existing a couple of years ago, and you can really see you really don't need the highlighting. There's some highlighting here, but how we have a linear city with density that connects different kind of major nodes of the city, but also very quickly, kind of transitions into this, very green, very livable, sort of medium to low density city beyond. And this just kind of says it all for what Atlanta is and what Atlanta could be. And something that's really unique about Atlanta and a city this size is that linearity and that kind of mix of density and livability kind of combined. So with that, I think we're going to wrap things up. If anyone's interested, you can look at online or download the Atlanta City Design at atlcitydesign.com. So please take a look at that, because again, I think it's a study that really gets Atlanta and is a really an important document in the life and the future of the city.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. And we've received several excellent questions during the discussion here. So looking at the first, it is, what is the biggest difference in doing an urban mixed use development like this versus a more suburban site?
That's an excellent question, really good question. We've of course done both. I think that more and more suburban sites are starting to look a little bit more like urban sites. They want the density, they want the mix of uses, they want the city feeling. I think the biggest difference may be in regulation. The city certainly has a little further along in zoning and regulations, and those things you need to understand. They are challenges, to be sure, maybe complications, but if they're used correctly, they help you. They really can help you to have a better development. So really, that's probably the main thing. There are obviously differences maybe in demographics, but definitely in your pro forma, how much you can charge for rent, those kind of things, which affect perhaps the style, but certainly affect the way that the development's put together from an architectural perspective. And also, just the demand or density or lack thereof around in a suburban environment that may mean you don't have as much of a demand for retail, a restaurant space at the base of the building. So that may end up being still an active streetscape, but maybe more residential. So there are all those things to consider. They are different animals, but they're sort of increasingly similar in a number of ways.
And then someone asked that you mentioned the height limitation written into the zoning, which seems difficult to achieve 6 stories. And then they're asking, was there any rezoning of the George site?
Yeah, and fortunately, there was not any rezoning of the George site, because we had written the zoning on this a few years before, and And actually, the third webinar in this series, which I think we're going to do in August, will really address kind of the idea of site selection. But one of the, and I'll give you a little preview of that. One of the major things is not having to do rezoning, finding hopefully a site that is already zoned appropriately, and where you have all of your zoning and you know, the city on board with what you're going to do there, which was the case here. You know, we had, again, we were hoisted by our own petard. We had to work with our own zoning, which was a little harder to work with than we thought it would be in order to make this happen, in order to meet the developer's pro forma, which is of course key because you can't do the development unless you do that. But we did overcome that, and I think we, you know, did a very nice project, you know, both for the city, for the people that live there, and a very profitable development for the owner, developer as well. So yeah, you know, rezoning is a possibility always. You know, if the demographics and the other elements are right, income and those kind of things in an area, adjacencies, that kind of thing, and it's not zoned properly. Sometimes zoning is going to be easy, going from industrial in an area that's becoming more residential. But in this case, if we had to rezone, it would have been very difficult because we had just rezoned and we had just gone through a long process with the neighborhoods, and they come back and say, hey, we're the guys who rezoned this into this thing that we spent years doing, but we want to rezone it again because it doesn't exactly fit our development. Would have been very difficult to do. So.
And then you and I have discussed before that part of their question here, I think, is about the height limitation and the ways in which we are averaging the height plane of the building, and with the city to discuss that and being strategic about how that height is defined as well.
Yeah.
So, and I think that this question may have been asked before you touched on this a bit, but if you could just make sure we addressed it here. The question is, was any consideration given to views as other developments are completed adjacent to the site?
Yeah. Sure, and we were very lucky in that way, that it can be an issue in other sites as the city gets more and more dense, especially in places like Midtown where high rises are springing up across the street from high rises, and that incredible view that you're advertising suddenly is blocked by another building. But that's just kind of the idea of living in a city. So that's something that I think folks have to get used to, and there are ways to configure geometry to preserve some of those views. But in our case, that was never an issue because obviously our main views to the west and north, we had, again, we were on that park, that linear park that ran between MLK and Memorial Drive, and so we couldn't be built right next to. In fact, there was a building that kind of reflects the density of our building across the park from there, but it is a sufficient sort of distance away from us that our views are really preserved. And of course, on the other side, the neighborhoods are protected historically, historic neighborhoods that are protected. So that view of the treetops and the neighborhood really will never go away, which is important also because we have our pool there and we wouldn't want to block the southern exposure.
Well, great. Well, with that, later today, you will receive an email that will allow you to download today's presentation and have an option to take a short survey. If you do complete that survey, we appreciate your feedback. We'll be glad to answer any future questions you may have. We hope that you'll join us for the next discussion, which will be at the end of July, and focus on 6 potential mixed-use residential development trends after the COVID-19 crisis, and include an open discussion with a prominent Atlanta mixed-use developer. So thanks again for joining, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.